I'm thrilled to be here for the first time at the seminar, so I'm more or less an unfamiliar face. My intention was to give the floor to every one of you to introduce yourselves, but that will take an hour or probably half of the time for this lecture. So I will jump straight in. Just before that, I would like to say that I'm deeply grateful to Anna and to the whole team for being here. And I hope to meet each and every one of the fellows and continue this conversation in a more informal setting. I am not a political scientist, and I'm a crypto historian with focus on cultural history rather than political history. So I will be much more in my own waters tomorrow when we talk about orthodoxy in Russia. But I was given the task to introduce Russia's relations to the Black Sea with a continuity, providing a continuity for the lecture of my colleague Tom DeVal this afternoon. So the big question that I will ask today is, why is Putin's Russia so focused on the Black Sea? What is its stakes in this interest in the Black Sea? And particularly why the return of Russia to the sea, so to speak, is anchored in Crimea. Tom will speak in the afternoon about the Straits. I will focus mostly on Crimea. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union pretty much controlled the Black Sea, so much so that it was called a Soviet lake. Turkey was the only force from NATO to have a substantial presence in the sea. And then in '91, Russia lost pretty much all its influence, retaining only a small, I don't have a pointer, somehow we couldn't connect the pointer, so you can see on the map between the Kerch Straits and Abkhazia in the south of Georgia, in the north of Georgia, is the only part of the littoral that was still controlled by Russia in '91, losing territories, not only because of the independence of Georgia and Ukraine, but also because Romania and Bulgaria left the Soviet bloc and later became members of both NATO and the European Union. And then 2008 marked the decisive return of Russia's interest to the sea with the invasion of Georgia, and then, of course, in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. The retaking of Crimea was the moment when Russia reestablished not only its ambitions southward, but a decisive control of the northern coast. And I will ask you, thank you. What was so important for this return? No doubt, the most prized possession was the full control of Sevastopol, because Sevastopol, according to the 1997 agreement between Russia and Ukraine, was split as the base for the Black Sea Fleet evenly between Ukraine and Russia. And in fact, Russia had to formally recognize the status of Crimea as a constitutive part of independent Ukraine and pay a lease, a pretty steep one, a yearly lease for the use of the base. Historically, Crimea is seen by Russia's self-imagination as the cradle of Russian orthodoxy, the birthplace of Russians' religion, which, according to the Russian contemporary discourses, is a state-forming religion, государствообразующая религия. In that sense, the peninsula is a repository of historical myths that are central for Russia's self-identity. But historical or symbolic capital is not reason enough for people to go to war. There are much deeper, both economic and especially strategic military reasons for the firm interest in both Crimea and the control of the sea. Crimea and the Straits are the two most important strategic points on the Black Sea. The Straits, because they provide the only gate for entering and exiting the sea. And Crimea, if you look at the map, this protruding peninsula, provides the shortest route for accessing the most remote parts on the Black Sea littoral. Whoever controls both Crimea and the Straits controls the sea. And for Russia, establishing a firm base on Crimea has always been the springboard for ambitions further south toward Istanbul and the Straits. And you know, the Russian invasion of the Black Sea began with Crimea back in the 18th century. So Constantinople, contemporary Istanbul, has always loomed large in the imagination of each and every Russian state. But until the 18th century, Russian states were much more interested in superseding Constantinople, the second Rome, rather than capturing it. And it all changed in the 18th century with Peter, with the establishment of the Russian Empire proper. So the appetite toward both the Straits and Crimea have always been entangled with Russian imperial ambitions. So what changed with Peter? And here I'm following my colleague Dick Wortman's notion that Russian sovereignty before Peter has always been derived from a purported continuity between Russian sovereign power and Byzantium. And with Peter, for the first time, Russian sovereignty was not dependent on divine blessing, not rooted in it, or in any kind of imaginary or real political connection back to Byzantium, but solely on the power of the sovereign established on the battlefield. So Peter was imperator in the old Roman sense of the term, as a victorious general whose power was established through conquest. And in that reframing of the idea of political power and capturing Constantinople became a prized ambition, which would, if the Russian Empire takes over Constantinople, it would mark the definitive victory over the Ottoman Empire. And so from the 18th century onward, you have a turn of Russia's ambitions south toward the sea. Peter, of course, was also the Russian sovereign who discovered or decisively took to heart the idea that an empire depends on a strong navy and began building Russian naval capabilities. But even though it started in the north with the establishment of the Baltic fleet, he was very much aware of the need to establish a warm water naval port and fleet, an ambition that was ultimately realized by his granddaughter, Catherine II, in the second part of the same century. So it is with Catherine and two victorious wars against the Ottomans that Russia established a presence in the Black Sea. The first war ended in 1774 with the famous Küçükayırca Treaties, which has a couple of important advantages for Russia. First and foremost, gave Russian ships free access to the sea all the way to the straits, and declared independence of Crimea, still as a Tatar-Mongol territory. But it also, for the first time in legal terms, established this R2P, as it is known, the right to protect clause that would become then a staple of Russian imperial rhetoric in relations with the Ottoman Empire for the next century and a half. The right to protect co-religionists in the Ottoman Empire, or the right of Russia to expand political influence and eventually control over the entire Pravoslavny Vostok. So this reorientation toward Orthodox populations within the Ottoman Empire, and particularly the Greeks, which will become important in a second for my narrative, is quite a shift also in the Russian imagination of themselves or of the Russian state on the Eastern Christian map. The idea of Moscow, the Third Rome, which emerged soon after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in the mid-15th century, was essentially a policy of isolationism. Russia, Moscow, is the heir of both the messianic power of Jerusalem as the seat of the vicar of Christ on earth, and the political heir of the power of Rome, the Roman Empire. But from Catherine's rule onward, and especially during the 19th century, there is a sense of leadership of the rest of the Orthodox communities, despite their fallen state in the eyes of the Russian Church, with the mission of the Russian Empire of both saving them and cleansing them from whatever perceived corruption there was. So immediately after Kuchuk and Archa, we have the rise of the so-called Greek project, which began with the proposition of the Eastern system by Potemkin, the general and the empress's lover, right after, the following year after Kuchuk and Archa, the Eastern system with reorientation southward that would replace Panin's northern system, previously ruling imperial policies. And probably the best formulated Greek project is in a letter by Catherine to Emperor Joseph of Austria in 82, that lays out a vision, a political vision for the ruling of Europe, which should again be ruled by Western and Eastern Roman empires, this time with centers in Vienna and in Petersburg, respectively. In this idea of the Russian Empire liberating old Byzantium from Ottoman rule and restoring the throne of Constantinople under Christian domination, we have an echo of the old Moscow the Third Rome ideology, but now with a peculiar twist. The neo-classical Western Enlightenment project of civilizing the barbarian world under the rulership of an enlightened monarch, restoring the Hellenistic culture in the lands that were barbarized by the Ottomans, is now reimagined by Catherine's, in Catherine's vision as a Russian civilizing mission based on a peculiar synthesis between the vision of Byzantium and as a direct heir of classical Greece, and based on the idea that Russia is, in fact, an heir to Byzantium, promotes this notion of Russia also being a direct heir to the ancient Greek culture, which gives it an edge to the civilized West. In this case, Russia's not dependent. Russia's new culture of the Enlightenment is not derivative of Western culture, but is directly based on its consanguinity and kinship with the Greeks. So this bizarre Greco-Roman synthesis, the false identification of Byzantium and Greco-Roman antiquity, becomes then the tenor of the imperial rhetoric of Catherine's conquest of the Black Sea. And it's immediately the year after she sent this letter to Joseph, we have the formal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Empire in 1783. And the reimagination of Krim, the Tatar Krim, as Greek or Hellenic territory with these Hellenized names. Krim itself is reimagined as Tavrida. New, old Crimean towns are rebuilt as modern cities under Neo-Hellenic names. So Sevastopol itself is the glorious polis, the imperial city. Simferopol is given a Greek name as well. And then Odessa, which is not in Crimea, but on the Black Sea shore, built in the later decades as the St. Petersburg in the south, is of course given another Greek name as the female version of Odessos. You see Varna there on the Bulgarian shore, whose Greek name is Odessos, masculine form of the same word derived from the Greek word for way. Anyways, and the whole, this new territory of the empire with its hinterland, Crimea and its hinterland, is reimagined, is created as Novorossiya, the new Russia, which becomes the springboard not only for military incursions into the Ottoman Empire. You can see in Sevastopol, which is built as the naval base on the Black Sea, so close to Sinop on the south shore of the sea, but also fairly close to Constantinople itself. It also becomes a springboard for commercial maritime export, import, and soon this part of the empire is a booming territory, providing more and more pressure on the Ottomans. The following Russo-Turkish War that Catherine successfully carries out, that ends in 92, begins in 87, puts the entire northern Black Sea littoral under Russian control from, you can see Dniester on the left side, all the way to Kuban, and also suzerainty over pretty much the whole South Caucasus. But it also opens the way to more wars that will be led in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, that pretty much threatens the Ottomans of being completely pushed out of the sea, which all leads to the Crimean War, and I'm not going to get into it. You know what happened there. But I will pose the question now, all this historical baggage that hinges on Crimea. To what degree do you think it motivated the return to the sea by Putin's policies in the last 15 years, which began not with the retaking of Crimea, but began with the invasion of Georgia in 2008, with the participation of the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol. And it continues during the current war in Ukraine with a lot of military action being focused on retaking pretty much the entire Ukrainian territories that border the sea, including the Sea of Azov, which is an extension of the Black Sea through the straits.